Hello and welcome again to Ethics and Leadership, where today we'll be following one of the first people to make the fundamental claim, Black Lives Matter. That's right, Frederick Douglass, the once slave, then freedman, was largely self-educated and became one of the most famous orators, and I'm going to call him a philosopher, in the United States in the period before the Civil War, during the Civil War, and after the Civil War. The guy lived a long life. He traveled a long ways, talked to a lot of people, and impressed just about every single one of them. In the background today, I've chosen a series of pictures of Frederick Douglass. And I've done this because he was one of the most photographed men of the 19th century. This was intentional on his part, as he wanted pictures of black men looking dignified to counter many of the pictures of black men that had been circulated, making them look like buffoons or clowns. At the time, blackface was a common form of entertainment, where white people would put on black makeup in order to make themselves clowns in variety shows. But Douglass never cracked a smile in his pictures. Instead, he adopted a stern face to emphasize that he was not a clown. He was not one of those laughing slaves. But he was a serious man, a man who demanded his own dignity and his own rights. And so, even in his photographs, he presented an argument for the full humanity of blacks. We need to say something about race. You need to say something about race because, well, we haven't thus far. I don't know if you've noticed, but as I've gone through the ancient philosophers and even to the modern philosophers, I've talked specifically about their relations to slavery and their relations to women. But I have not talked about race. And in part, this is because they didn't specifically address it. Even Locke, when he's putting forward his theory of slavery, never brings up the issue of race, which I suggested actually makes his theory a little bit out of touch with slavery as it existed at the time. By the time of Locke, there certainly was a developed idea of race, but that hasn't been true for very long. Actually, it's with the development of modernity through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment that the idea of race actually emerges. In the classical world, there is no perfect parallel to the idea of race. There are certainly different tribes, different locations that people exist, and there is some recognition that people have different skin tones, but there's not a developed idea that this is a significant division between them, that is a kind of division between different species or different sets of human beings. For Aristotle, the key division was between civilized people and barbarians, but that had a lot to do with how you were raised, not particularly any natural status that you have. Otherwise, he talked about natural slaves and natural masters, but he didn't associate that with skin tone or the location that someone was born in. No, to get current ideas of race, we have to move on to the period of conquest and colonialization and the early development of modern science, because these things came together in order to provide the ideas that were necessary in order to develop our contemporary ideas of race. You see, modern science, which underwrites the theory of race, claiming that, in fact, there is some biological basis for the difference between races, is developing at the same time as colonialism. So the Spanish are going and they are conquering the Americas with their conquistadores, and they're taking over Native American peoples. Well, this actually creates a moral problem for them, because the Spanish are also good Roman Catholics, and being good Roman Catholics, they know their Thomas Aquinas, and so they're familiar with natural law, the idea that, as a matter of fact, all people have access to a natural law, which will allow them to be self-ruling to some extent. And several scholars of the time recognized this fact, and argued that the conquest that was in fact immoral. But another set of scholars sought to justify the conquest. Amongst them was a guy named Sepulveda. Now, Sepulveda argued that because although all men have access to the natural law, beasts do not. And despite having never been to the Americas or ever come into contact with a Native American, he argued that the Native Americans were clearly not truly men, but in fact beasts. So there must be some biological difference between the Spaniards and these Native Americans that made the Native Americans naturally into kinds of beasts. From here, it was a short step for Sepulveda to draw upon Aristotle and his theory of natural slavery. So as soon as we've established that, I don't know how we've established it, as soon as we've asserted that we're men and you're beasts, then you clearly don't have the ability to control yourselves. As a matter of fact, putting us in control over you will allow you to have a better life and us to have a better life. It'll be better for everybody, really, if we come in and conquer the Americas. Well, while there were arguments about this, you can imagine which arguments were more successful with those who wanted to go over and conquer. And those were the people who had power. Unfortunately, oftentimes that's the way moral arguments get sorted out in the short run. And so the idea of a fundamental biological difference between people of different races was established. This could be easily expanded out for the colonialists who were moving down into Africa, who could then declare the people there to be beasts and claim that then they had no rights to rule themselves and that having other people ruling over them was for their own best. Of course, no one actually paid attention to the restrictions in Aristotle's system of slavery as they were going about this, and they used this justification as carte blanche for basically doing whatever they wanted with other people's lives. But my broader point here is that before the Renaissance and before modernity, there really was no such thing as race. Race just didn't exist as a category that was important. Now, it's strange to think that, because race is so built into our culture that it's almost impossible to think yourself beyond the category. And at this point, it's not clear that it would be morally good for us simply to think beyond the category, because people have, in fact, been treated in the past in accord with their particular race. And if we pay attention to even Locke's ideas of just recompense, in order to pay people back, in order to set the scales even, we need to pay attention to race in order to do that. Now, that idea, the idea of getting over race blindness to come to a picture of race recompense, is a fairly contemporary idea in racial study, and it's certainly not one that Frederick Douglass was familiar with. So we're going to have to pull ourselves a little bit back from this discussion to get into Douglass himself and Douglass's thought. So let's say a little bit about Douglass. The first thing you might note about Douglass, if you go through his own biography and his speeches, is that he's not entirely consistent. Douglass was more of an activist than he was a philosopher. But in some ways, this is so typical of American philosophy itself, because American philosophy has been shaped by a movement that's called Pragmatism. Now, Pragmatism has ties to a kind of Burkean conservatism, which we saw last time, that idea that, as a matter of fact, what you should try and do is move progressively over time by kind of small motions and see what works. But it's also shaped by a kind of bourgeois sentiment. The idea that we ought to achieve what we can achieve now with the costs that are as low as they can be. Now, you might picture Frederick Douglass as a kind of radical, and there's no doubt that he was, in some senses, a radical, especially given the society in which he lived. He pushed for equal rights, both for blacks and for women across the United States. you can find him in unqualified statements about both of these concerns. And as a matter of fact, at one point he said, if they bring it up for the black man to gain the vote, but not the woman, I would not take the right to vote because we should all be equal with each other. What makes Douglass a little bit more of a pragmatist is the fact that when they actually did bring up the opportunity for blacks to vote, but not for women, he accepted. This was against the counsel of some of his good feminist friends who said that their own struggle for equality and suffrage would be harmed if they couldn't be included with black men. Douglass recognized the tension here, but eventually decided that achieving suffrage for black men could be a first step by which you move towards universal suffrage, which eventually, a while later, did come to women. Sorry, ladies, you get screwed over so often. Douglass was also a pragmatist in his choice of conversation partners. While many radical Democrats, feminists, and advocates for black rights refused to talk to groups who had members who were slave owners, Frederick Douglass was open in achieving his partnerships all over the place. And he said, I will partner with anyone for the good, but never for the evil. Embracing the idea that he could pick and choose who he wanted to work with on particular projects, provided that the members of those groups worked with him on those particular projects, even if they disagreed in other areas. In many of these ways, Frederick Douglass was a kind of embodiment of idealized democratic practice. He was not only an advocate for democracy, but a virtuous participant. Now let's take on some of Frederick Douglass's arguments against slavery, or, in part, the fact that he refused to argue about it. It has to be said, both for Wollstonecraft and for Douglass, that if the charge is that you are naturally unequal, that you are naturally inferior, one of the best ways to defeat that argument is by being a badass. Something that Wollstonecraft and Frederick Douglass both achieved in spades. Douglass, like Wollstonecraft, went back and forth with the heavyweights of his own age, and he emerged regularly on top. He was one of the most in-demand orators of the period, and this was a period in which oratory, that is the giving of speeches, was a high form not only of politics but of entertainment. I mean, they didn't have radios, they didn't have TVs, they went out and watched people give speeches. It was a different time. And Douglass was a master. He went across the United States giving series of speeches to thousands of people. It became something that you would be able to tell your children. One day I saw Frederick Douglass give a speech. By the end, it was impossible to argue against the presence of his intellect and his incredible capacities. And perhaps fair enough, this is part of what's behind his claim that there's no need to argue about the equality of the white man and the black man in terms of their basic humanity. I submit, where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued. What point in the anti-slavery creed would you have me argue? On what branch of this subject do the people of this country need light? Must I undertake to prove that slave is a man? Well, the answer, he thought, is clearly no. But that didn't stop him from going ahead and providing some pretty good arguments. For instance, this doozy. Southern statute books are covered with enactments forbidding, under severe fines and penalties, the teaching of the slave to read or write. When you can point to any such laws in reference to the beasts of the field, then I may consent to argue the manhood of a slave. I mean, look at the absurdity of the position that he's just put slave owners in. Look, if you don't believe slaves are human beings, then you shouldn't have any problem educating them. The problem is, you know that educating them will actually allow them to know about their own dignity and their own human rights. So your own system is hypocritical. It disagrees with itself. These are the best kinds of arguments. Douglass himself, when he was a child, had one of his owner's wives who decided that she was going to educate him, and she started to teach him the alphabet and how to read until her husband found out. And he came in and he berated his wife for teaching this slave his education. Douglass later called it the best anti-slavery speech he's ever heard because it underwrote exactly this argument. So what shall we make of apparent inferiorities amongst blacks as compared to whites? Well, here, Douglass's move was very similar to Wollstonecraft. You'll recall that Wollstonecraft gave an account of contemporary education, which enculturated women to think about themselves in terms of their beauty rather than their minds. Here, Douglass claims, what? Am I to argue that it's wrong to make men brutes? This is important because in Douglass's picture, it is not the case that the black is a brute, but it might be the case that the black is brutalized by society. That the black could be forced into a position barely above bestiality. But that doesn't have anything to do with the natural character of the black. It has to do with how they are treated. So again, the fundamental problem is hypocrisy. It is hypocritical to force someone into a position of a brute and then claim that them being in a position similar to a brute is a justification for you treating them in the way that you've treated them. Frederick's rhetoric and his logic make for a compelling case. As Frederick went, he ran into a fundamental problem that we see again and again in the cases of minorities. As you recall, with Wollstonecraft, there was this issue of reason and appetites. And the question, should you accept the classical dichotomy and then argue against the way that it's been applied, or should you argue against the classical dichotomy? In a similar way, Douglass had an issue with the founding documents of the United States. The founding documents laid out the order of American society, and that was an order which had justified the institution of slavery, and had even gone beyond that, in granting Southern states a compromise which allowed the Southern states to count their slaves as part of their population in order to gain representation in the government. This provision ensured that the Southern states in the early United States had enough representation that they could always defend the institution of slavery itself. So these elements were built into some of the founding documents of the country. And early on, Douglass undertook then to argue against these documents, and to suggest that America rested upon a foundation of racism. Well, there's no doubt that the founding documents included racism, and that in some sense that was present at the founding of the United States. But there are a couple of issues that eventually led Douglass to change his position on the founding documents. One was an argument by a man named Spooner that the Constitution actually was an anti-slavery document, and that it was simply waiting to be implemented properly so as to bring about an end to slavery. The other was, doubtless, simply a question of strategy. The founding documents of the United States hold a place just short of the sacred in our society. And so arguing against them places you against one of the authoritative sources. If you can instead find a way to claim that those sources actually underwrite your argument, you'll be in a much stronger rhetorical position. So eventually, this was exactly what Douglass did. He adopted the language and the forms of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution to argue against slavery. This, of course, led him back into the tradition of natural law. Because of those beginning lines of the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. Again, here we can see some of the unintended consequences of that phrase as people read it and agree with it and think that it actually has a wider application than its original authors might have intended. So once he believes that he's established that the black man is in fact a man, Douglass can come around to ask, would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty? That he is the rightful owner of his own body? Well, have you heard that before? Absolutely. There, he is simply quoting the ideas of John Locke. And so he can conclude by saying, you've already declared it. I don't have to argue this point. It's, as a matter of fact, in your own founding documents for the country. In that very Lockean liberal tradition, Douglass could also find justification for violence, similar to the way that Wollstonecraft had justified the French Revolution. He believed that violence would be justified in ending slavery, because slavery fundamentally violated the rights of black people. And any government that fails to protect the rights of its own citizens deserves to be overthrown. Douglass traced his own discovery of the justification of violence to a case when he was a slave and he was sold to a man named Covey. Now, Covey was known as a slave breaker. He treated his slaves particularly cruelly, and so you could give him the toughest of slaves so that he could break their spirit. But one day when he went to whip Douglass, Douglass turned around and fought him man to man, and as a matter of fact beat him in the fist fight. He said that never after that did Covey ever attempt to whip him. And in this moment, he says, he found his own dignity, his own manhood, as he says. This he obviously later identifies with the claim that people have natural rights and that they have an ownership over their own bodies. And in support of the natural law tradition, he supported several violent actions, although as a pragmatist he was always a little bit ambiguous about this because he only wanted violent actions that would in fact be successful. This led to a little bit of a conflict between he and John Brown. John Brown was an abolitionist who attempted in his attack on Harper's Ferry to start a slave revolt that would then run its way through the South. Many times people imagine that a kind of small act of violence will tip the scales towards a great uprising, and they don't actually achieve it. So John Brown had actually invited Douglass to go along with him on the raid of Harper's Ferry, but Douglass had disagreed. He was holding out for an act that might have a better chance of success. And this came along with the Civil War, which Douglass unambiguously supported. This was a morally justified war, not only on general moral grounds, but upon the particular grounds that are the foundation of the United States. If Americans were going to embrace the kind of liberalism that Locke had laid out, it was an inevitable consequence that further people would have to gain their own rights and be treated with equal dignity as we move forward as a country. Now, while treating Wollstonecraft, we shortly discussed the issue between a kind of segregation or integration of society, where different people in minority groups argue for different options here. Some think that separating themselves from the society will in fact allow them to develop their own systems of education and will allow themselves to develop their own power, while others favor integration. Well, it's clear that those who were in favor of radical democracy and the mainline liberal tradition tended to favor integration. Wollstonecraft did, and Frederick Douglass did. Long before the decision of Brown v. Board of Education, which found that separate in schools can never actually be equal, Frederick Douglass was arguing that the United States needed to integrate all of its institutions, something that the United States has never successfully done. But Douglass even went further than this, because he went so far as to argue that the idea of race was in fact imaginary. There was really only one human race. And so when we think about particular races, we are simply thinking about the mixture of people who lived in a particular place at a particular time. He thus believed that over time, what would happen in the United States was a process of amalgamation, that you would have intermarriages between people of all different races, and eventually you would have something that came out just being the American race, because it was a mixture of all the different people who lived in America at that particular time. In retrospect, we may see this as a little bit utopian, but actually he's fairly advanced in realizing that race does not exist as a fundamental biological construct, and that these categories are in fact extremely malleable. While our society hasn't actually come to the point that we could possibly move beyond thinking about race, and as I suggested, there are moral reasons that we probably shouldn't think beyond race at this point, there is an undeniable truth to Frederick Douglass's insight that race at the end of the day is an extremely contingent category. Now, we've established that Douglass is, in fact, a part of that main line of the liberal tradition coming out of Locke. But what does Frederick Douglass do with individualism? Does he favor a starting point with the individual when thinking about society? Well, definitely, there was a kind of ideal image that he picked up and that he espoused quite brilliantly in terms of the self-made man. One of his most famous speeches is, in fact, the self-made man, where he says things like, "He who does not think himself worth saving from poverty and ignorance by his own efforts will hardly be thought worth the efforts of anybody else." So in this, he certainly overlaps with Franklin's virtue of industry and Locke's picture, which says that property arises from the labor and effort that people put into it. But those who make too much of the self-made man image in his speech overlook a significant amount of what Douglass said in the speech. So here to read a long passage: "Our best and most valued acquisitions have been obtained either from our contemporaries or from those who have preceded us in the field of thought and discovery. We have all either begged, borrowed, or stolen. We have reaped where others have sown, and that which others have strown we have gathered. It must in truth be said, though it may not accord well with the self-conscious individuality and self-conceit, that no possible native force of character and no depth of wealth and originality can lift a man into absolute independence of his fellow men, and no generation of men can be independent of the preceding generation. The brotherhood and interdependence of mankind are guarded and defended at all points." So how are we supposed to put these two together? Well, I suspect that what's at stake here for Frederick Douglass is not a fundamental philosophical position that embraces either individuality above the society or the society above the individual. Rather, he is probably talking to people and saying that they need to be motivated as that self-made man would be motivated. That people are improved by their own industry, and that is the way to get ahead in American and democratic society. But he doesn't at that same time want to embrace the claim that we are actually separate from other people. As many of his biographers have pointed out, Douglass was dependent on a whole set of people through the process when he escaped from slavery, being empowered through his education by others, and that he was, as a matter of fact, nowhere near a self-made man. But I think there can also be no doubt that Frederick Douglass embraced a picture of industry and labor that he himself pursued relentlessly, going around the states and arguing for the positions that he held. He also seems not to have developed any criticism of the economic structures of the United States. He blamed most of the inequality that he saw upon the structures of slavery. So similar to Wollstonecraft, who was focused on bringing down monarchy and nobility, Frederick Douglass was focused on bringing down the institution of slavery. And he did not develop much past that a criticism of the inequalities that continued on after slavery. As a matter of fact, those things which he has to say in favor of an unbounded market economy are generally positive. So you can see him as he turns to his more positive section in your reading for today, saying that the arms of commerce has borne away the gates of the strong city, and intelligence is penetrating the darkest corners of the globe. He imagined that with the spread of free commerce would come freedom and an improvement of society for everyone. In another speech, he makes the claim that one of the curses of our race is poverty. Money is not exactly the root of all evil. We must acquire property and we must leave something. So here he was arguing in favor of acquisition. Now you note that this was not an address to the problem of inequality. He was not addressing his speech to rather wealthy white people, but rather to black people who did not have goods. And he was trying to convince them that in order to get ahead in American society, you had to acquire goods, and you had to build up a reservoir of acquired goods to hand on to your children. This, he believed, was a key to upward social mobility. All right, so let's tie Douglass into some of the themes for our class. First, human nature. Well, here, again, Douglass sits within the basic liberal line of thought, where he says that humans are rational, sensitive animals. But he would want to add on, within particular social systems, they can lose their way morally, because he recognizes that within the system of slavery, the minds of both slave masters and slaves are contorted by the institution that they live in. It's important to recognize that both Wollstonecraft and Douglass place this additional qualification on human nature, that it is so malleable, because both of them want to provide an account of apparent inequality, which is created by the society rather than being a part of their fundamental nature. Social or individual. Here, Douglass wants to claim that humans need the individual initiative of the self-made man, but he also recognizes that they're never truly independent of history or society. Again, they are shaped by the institutions in which they participate, and they build upon that which has come in front of them. People and property. Well, here, presumably, Douglass finds with Locke that people have a right to that which they've put their labor into. Participation in the accumulation of wealth is a mechanism for gaining social stability and mobility. The extension of commerce breaks down old hierarchical orders. So, in general, a fairly uncritical acceptance of the developing modern economy. Equality or inequality. Humans, he thinks, are born with equal rights, at least the rights to life, liberty, and property. The shape of government? Well, he's a radical Democrat. He's in favor of democracy or a republic. The purpose of government? To protect the natural rights of all citizens, regardless of race, And really with Wollstonecraft and he, we could go back and forth here because both of them felt that the government had an obligation to protect rights regardless of race or gender. What authorizes leadership? The consent of the governed. Now, at this point, you'll note that we've actually had the same thing in the bottom category for our last three figures, for Locke, for Wollstonecraft, and for Douglass. But we also have to recognize that what this means has evolved as we've moved across the three of them. Because apparently for Locke, consent of the government meant primarily consent of land-owning white males. But as we go on, it is the others who continue to expand out what all men means in the claim that all men are created equal. And this is the form that the philosophical advance of equality in rights takes within the main line of liberalism. There will be some who think that in order to push past this kind of equality, we need to push past these main lines of liberalism that we've seen across Locke, Wollstonecraft, and Douglass. And so we'll get to some of those revolutionary positions as we continue. But at present, we're within the center lines of this liberal tradition, and we're moving ever more close to the contemporary world. Before we get there, we've got a couple more stops, as we're going to check in with utilitarianism, which builds on the kind of hedonism that we saw occasionally mentioned in Locke, and we're going to go past Marx, who really sits at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and thus the emergence of economic inequalities at levels that people had not seen before. So we'll come back to that in our next set of lectures. As for right now, I'll conclude with Frederick Douglass and this extension of equality throughout the liberal model. I'll see you in the next lectures.